So let's talk about camera settings for street photography. How to have a simple way of setting up your camera so that whenever you want to take the photo, you just press the shutter and you don't need to think about anything else. You can be sure that the optimal settings are used every time. If you're new to this channel, my name is Micael Widell. Welcome. I've been doing videos about street photography and macro photography on YouTube for more than 7 years. If that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's get on with the video. I have the same kind of settings on both my main cameras, the Sony A9 Mark II and the Ricoh GR3X. And what I typically do is just to set the camera first of all in Aperture priority mode. Because that is something I do want to vary. I want to vary the depth of field, meaning the aperture. Sometimes I want a shallow depth of field and sometimes I want as deep depth of field as possible. So it's nice to have the camera as a base in Aperture priority mode because then I can quickly change the depth of field. So what about shutter speed and ISO? Well, you might have seen the exposure triangle. Basically, whenever you're outdoors shooting, you have a certain amount of light depending on the weather, and you have to allocate this light among these three, the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, depending on what kind of effect you want. And typically the more light you have, the better photo you can get, because you can have a very fast shutter speed if you have a lot of light, and you can have a low ISO, meaning very little noise, and you can have the aperture you want, no matter if it's a deep depth of field or a short depth of field. The more light you have, the more options you have. But you don't always have lots of light. Sometimes you're shooting in the night or in the evening or in dark weather. Maybe there are thick clouds. And then you have to make the best result possible with your light you have. And if we have set the aperture to whatever we want it to be, maybe f11 if it's a deep depth of field we want, or f2.0 if you want a shallow depth of field. Then we need to divide the light up between the ISO and the shutter speed the best way we can. And when it comes to shutter speed, of course, we most of the time want to have it as fast as possible because we want a sharp photo. And the ISO, we want it as low as possible, typically, because we don't want too much noise. But when doing street photography, we don't want to stand there changing all these settings all the time. We don't have time for that. It's too tedious. So we want the camera to handle this by itself in the best way possible. And what you can do on most newer cameras, at least on the A9 Mark II and on the Ricoh GR3 cameras, is that you can set the camera in auto ISO. So it always tries to put the ISO as low as possible, but still with a decent shutter speed. And then the powerful thing is that you can combine auto ISO with a certain span of ISOs that you find acceptable. So, for example, I usually set the span between ISO 200 to around 2500, because above 2500 I find that the picture becomes a bit too noisy. So then, depending on how much light is available, the camera will set an ISO within that range, but it will never go above or below that range, so it will keep within that range. And then, for example, if it is pretty dark, the ISO will hit the ceiling, it will be 2500. And then we have locked in the aperture, because we are in aperture priority mode, and also the ISO is locked in. And then it will simply pick the fastest possible shutter speed that we have left. And that is how all this works. But you also, with this auto ISO setting, can define a minimum shutter speed that you want to use. And this, of course, depends on what kind of situations you're shooting. But when I'm doing street photography, typically I want the photos to be as sharp as possible. So I typically set the shutter speed a minimum of 1/500th of a second, which means that whenever possible, the camera will try to respect that. It will try to set the shutter speed of a minimum of 1/500th of a second. And if that requires a high ISO, because the light is not super bright, then it will set a high ISO. But it will never go beyond the frame that I've set of an ISO between 200 and 2500. So if it is dark and I set a small aperture, maybe f11, and the ISO hits the ceiling, it goes to 2500, then we need to sacrifice something, and what the camera will then sacrifice, I have found, is the shutter speed. And I think this is as it should be. And then if you find that the shutter speed is very, very important, you want it to be as high as possible, yeah, then you have to increase the ceiling in ISO. Anyways, I have found that with these settings, aperture priority and a window of acceptable ISOs, and a wish for a minimum shutter speed. If you set these three settings, you get a very good algorithm for point and shoot street photography. I set these settings, I can just go around, just press the shutter whenever I see a photo opportunity, and I know the camera will do its best to use the settings that I would want it to use if I had set them manually. So I find that this is very good for street photography. So whenever I want to adjust the depth of field, I just spin this wheel on the front here to change the aperture, and it's very simple. And then I have also bound the setting for minimum shutter speed to one of the buttons on the back of my camera, so I can very quickly switch that. For example, if I'm gonna shoot something that moves very, very quickly, like someone on a bike, I just set it to 1000. And that way I can get the best possible result with the least possible amount of noise in a very simple way. And I know on slightly older cameras, maybe 5 years or older than that, this was not possible. Then usually you couldn't set this ISO window or the minimum shutter speed in combination with auto ISO. And what I did then was I usually did shoot in aperture priority still, but then I usually set the ISO manually to something that was sensible, that gave me the shutter speeds I wanted. So for example, if it was a very bright day, I set the ISO to 100 because then the shutter speed would be fast anyway. But if it was a slightly cloudy or dark day, I set the ISO to maybe 800, and then I knew that I would get decent shutter speeds. And then when I was shooting at night or in the evening when it was pretty dark, then I would switch the camera to shutter priority mode and set a shutter speed that I deemed would be the minimum viable, maybe 1/60th of a second. And then I would combine that with auto ISO, and whatever ISO was needed, that was the ISO that the camera would use. So that is something you could do if you don't have these more modern auto ISO settings where you can define a range of the ISO and a minimum shutter speed. I'm also curious to know what settings you use when you're doing street photography. Please tell me in the comments below, maybe I can learn something, and see you very soon again in the next video.